Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Jason Bent, and in this video, I'm going to be walking you through the steps that I took to build this walnut floating nightstand. Before I get into the build, I want to take an opportunity to thank one of my sponsors, and that is Hartzell Hardwoods, for providing the walnut that you see me going through here for this project. If you want to learn more about Hartzell Hardwoods, there is a link in the video description, and along with that, there are plans for this build, and I will leave a link to those in the video description as well. Now, my intent for these floating nightstands is that I wanted them to have the waterfall effect. So after I went through the wood and found the best pieces to use for this project, I took them over to the assembly table where I started marking everything. Because this is rough lumber, I prefer not to cut it on my miter saw, so I like to lay out all the lines and everything prior to and cut everything down to more manageable pieces using my jigsaw, because it really helps with the milling process because it gives me much smaller pieces to handle during the jointing and planing. Being able to have smaller pieces I find not only to be safer, but has always given me the best results during the milling process. Once I got everything milled to the thickness that I wanted, it was time to glue up the panels, and you see me gluing up two separate panels. The one that I'm currently gluing up is the one that will act as the sides and the top, and the one that is closest to the camera will be the bottom. The reason that I did it like this is because, again, it gave me the opportunity to mill shorter pieces, and I also don't care if the bottom has the same waterfall effect since it will not be seen. After getting everything clamped up, I always take the opportunity to clean up any glue squeeze out just because it helps with the finishing and sanding process. I allowed the panels to dry overnight, and the next day I went out in the shop, unclamped the panels, and started to run them through my drum sander. The reason that I like to do this is because it ensures that the panel is flat and removes any imperfections that may have happened during the glue up process, as well as removing any of the excess glue. Now, since I ran them through the drum sander and flattened them out, the edges may not be square to the surface anymore, so at this point I'm using my track saw to cut a nice clean reference edge that I will then use at the table saw to rip this to final width. From there, I just did a quick sanding, and I usually go up to the grit prior to my finished grit at this point, and that's really just to help remove any marks from the drum sander. The next step was to cut one side, then the top, then the other side, and then the bottom. To do this, I set two different flag stops at my miter saw station and started with a side, then moved to the further flag stop for the top, and then moved back to the original flag stop for the other side. Once each one of my pieces was cut, I then moved it back over to my assembly table where I used some of this green painter's tape to label each one of my parts just so I don't lose track of what order they're supposed to go in. I find this to be a very helpful technique, especially when I am doing anything that has a waterfall effect to it. Since all of these panels were relatively small, I used my favorite technique to cut miters, and that is using a router table and a 45-degree chamfer bit. This method has given me perfect results every time, and if you want to find out how I go about doing this, I'll go ahead and leave a link to that video in the corner now. After cutting the miters on all four pieces, I then used my domino and some 4mm dominoes on each end, really just to help keep everything in alignment during glue up. The next step is going to be the actual glue up, and before I do the glue up, I take an opportunity to use again some of this green painter's tape, and I place it on the inside edge for each one of the miters. The reason that I take the time to do this is because glue squeeze out is a huge pain on the inside of a box, as I'm sure most of you know if you've ever experienced it. So by putting this tape on, it makes for cleanup on the interior portion very easy, because after you have everything glued up, you just remove the tape and it's nice and clean. I'm not worried about the squeeze out on the outside because all of that will get sanded down. And after the box was glued up and roughly assembled, I used two of these Bessey strap clamps and tightened everything down, and they worked really well. And I thought I was going to need more than two, but two worked out just fine. And once I had it all glued up, did a quick check for square, and everything was good. While that was set off to the side to dry, I started breaking down the material for the drawer. For the bottom panel of the drawer, I decided to resaw a piece of scrap walnut that I had laying around so I could have a book-matched panel. After cutting it at the bandsaw, I'll run it through the drum sander to remove any saw marks. Next, I went ahead and glued up the two pieces to make my panel, and again, you'll see me using some of this painter's tape, which if you haven't noticed by now, I tend to use quite a bit of it in my shop. Because I did not want to wait a long time for this panel, I went ahead and used some Titebond Quick and Thick and glued it up and just set it off to the side. Because this is such a thin panel, I didn't use any clamps. Again, just used some of this green painter's tape to help pull the pieces together while the glue set up. While the panel dried, I went ahead and cut all of the slots to accept that panel in each one of my drawer pieces. And then I decided to use through dominoes for the main construction on each one of the drawer boxes. And then I decided to get overly fancy and thought I would make my own Bubinga dominoes, which, again, I'm not going to explain how I go about doing that. If you want to see a video on how I go about making my own dominoes, I'll go ahead and leave that link up in the corner now. And then as I was assembling the drawer box, I realized that it definitely does not have the effect that I was going for because the end grain of Bubinga is very dark, much like walnut. And after I had the drawer box assembled, I went ahead and clamped it up and set it off to the side to dry. Next, I focused on the back panel that will be visible from the front, and this does not extend all the way in the cabinet, which you'll see here in just a moment. And to do this, I simply used pocket screws. Next, I moved on to the drawer hardware, and for this project, I decided to use the Bloom 563H undermount drawer slides. However, you could use any type of drawer slides that you want. To mount the drawer slides, I used a spacer and then marked 3 locations for the holes that I will then drill 5mm holes to accept my 5mm Euro screws. Once that's complete, I then put my spacer back in just to ensure alignment and go ahead and screw in my 3 screws. I follow the same steps on both sides and it leaves me with my drawer slides installed. The method that I chose to hang each one of these floating nightstands was a French cleat, and so that's what I'm moving on to now. And to attach the French cleat, I used the same method as the back panel, and that was just using some pocket holes. And the opening that you will see in the back is the space for the piece that is actually mounted to the wall to fit in to complete the French cleat. So now that the box was complete, I went back to the drawer and just got everything sanded down nice and flush to include the exposed tenons, and I could have used a flush trim saw for this. However, it was just as easy to use the sander and get everything nice and flush. This is also when I realized that I did not cut the notches needed on the backs of the drawers because I was using the undermount drawer slides, and so to correct this, I just used a 1/2-inch router bit and went to the router table and cut the grooves that I needed. Next, I went ahead and mounted the adjustable clips that go on the front bottom side of the cabinet drawer. Then I went ahead and inserted the drawer and made sure everything fit and everything worked out great. From there, I went ahead and attached my drawer front. And for the reveal on the drawer front, I wanted roughly a 2mm reveal. So that's why you see me using those spacers on the top of the drawer front. Once that was done, I went ahead and removed the drawer and applied a small chamfer on the outside of the drawer front and on the inside of the nightstand itself. I did this to add a little bit of visual depth when you're looking at it from the front, and I'm glad that I did. The chamfer bit doesn't reach all the way into the corners, so to clean it up, I just use this small chisel and continue the pattern all the way into the corner. Now that the main construction was actually complete, I went ahead and removed any hardware and started finalizing everything for the finish. And I know this will be a shocker for some of you, but the finish that I'm using on this project is Rubio Monocoat. I first wipe everything down with a Rubio raw wood cleaner. Once the raw wood cleaner had an opportunity to dry, I went ahead and started to apply the Rubio. And again, this is a topic that I have done a YouTube video on, and if you guys want to find out a more in-depth look at how I go about applying Rubio, I'll go ahead and leave a link to that video up in the corner now. Before setting it off the side to dry for 24 hours, I wipe any excess Rubio that's on the project down, and the project is done. This was a really fun project, and if you want to go ahead and give this one a try yourself, again, I'll leave a link to the plans down in the video description. As always, everybody, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, get out in the shop, try something new, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.